A peaceful day on the farm takes a shocking turn when a horse goes into labor, giving birth to something so rare, the farmer screams, "Call 911!" But it's not just the birth that stuns everyone. It's what the vet discovers next. How could this happen? What makes this event so extraordinary? As the family fights to save the fragile newborns, financial troubles and a mysterious stranger threaten their farm. What secrets will be revealed? What lengths will they go to protect the foals? And how will this life-changing event unite a broken family? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Dawn painted the Miller Farm's main stable in soft golden hues as Daisy's labored breathing filled the air. Emma Miller, her blonde hair hastily tied back, knelt beside the mare, stroking her neck with gentle hands. John Miller paced nearby, his weathered face creased with worry, boots scuffing against the hay-strewn floor. "It's okay, girl," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "You're doing great." The sound of tires on gravel announced Dr. Susan Thompson's arrival. The veterinarian hurried in, medical bag in hand, her practical demeanor a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere in the stable. "How long has she been in labor?" Dr. Thompson asked, pulling on her gloves. "About 2 hours," John replied, running a hand through his graying hair. What followed was a blur of activity as Daisy's labor intensified. Emma held her breath, gripping her father's arm as the first foal emerged, a chestnut colt with a white blaze down his face. But before anyone could celebrate, Daisy's contractions continued. "There's another one," Dr. Thompson announced, her voice tight with concentration. Minutes later, a second foal appeared, smaller and darker than its sibling. The stable fell silent except for Daisy's heavy breathing and the weak sounds from the newborns. As morning light streamed through the stable windows, Dr. Thompson examined the foals thoroughly. The larger one, whom Emma had already started calling Blaze, showed signs of weakness, but managed to breathe steadily. Shadow, the smaller foal, barely moved. "I need to be honest with you both," Dr. Thompson said, straightening up. Her face was grave as she faced John and Emma. "Twin foals are extremely rare, and their survival rate is very low. These two are particularly fragile." Emma's heart seemed to stop. "But they're alive," she protested. "They're fighting." Dr. Thompson shook her head slowly. "In cases like this, it's often kinder to euthanize them both before they suffer needlessly. The smaller one especially shows signs of severe weakness. I don't expect him to survive the day." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes as she looked at the tiny foals struggling to live. The loss of her mother 6 months ago was still raw, and now this. It felt like too much to bear. "No," she whispered, then louder. "No, we can't just give up on them." John stood silently, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. The financial strain of the farm weighed heavily on his shoulders, and the prospect of caring for 2 sick foals seemed overwhelming. Outside the stable, the morning sun climbed higher as Emma turned to her father, her voice breaking. "Dad, please. Mom would have wanted us to try. She always said every life deserves a chance." John's jaw tightened at the mention of his late wife. He looked from the foals to his daughter's pleading face, then to Dr. Thompson's concerned expression. "I need time to think," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. Dr. Thompson gathered her equipment, pausing at the stable door. "Don't wait too long, John. That smaller one, Shadow, he needs intervention soon if there's any hope at all. Without it, nature will take its course, and it won't be pleasant." Emma knelt between the 2 foals, her tears falling freely now as she watched their struggle for life. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air as Dr. Thompson's truck pulled away from the farm. John Miller sat at his worn kitchen table, fingers tracing the edges of a well-loved photograph. In it, His wife Sarah smiled back at him, her eyes twinkling with joy as her arms wrapped around a younger Emma at last year's county fair. The afternoon sun streaming through the dusty window caught the dust motes dancing in the air, making them shimmer like tiny stars in a forgotten galaxy. His eyes drifted reluctantly to the growing pile of bills beside the photo. Angry red stamps marked "Final Notice" seemed to mock him from every envelope, each one a reminder of his mounting struggles. The farm's mortgage payment was already 2 months behind, and feed costs kept rising with no end in sight. 2 foals would mean double the expenses he couldn't afford no matter how he juggled the numbers. "What would you do, Sarah?" he whispered to the photograph, his callous finger gently touching her face. "I can barely keep the farm running as it is." His throat tightened painfully as he remembered how she always knew the right thing to do, how she could make even the toughest decisions while keeping their hearts intact. The empty chair across from him seemed to echo with her absence. Meanwhile, in the stable's warm darkness, Emma checked on the newborn foals. Blaze had managed to find his feet, wobbling like a newborn colt should, his legs splaying occasionally on the hay-strewn floor. His chestnut coat gleamed like polished copper in the afternoon light as he took tentative steps toward Daisy, who nickered encouragingly. But Shadow remained curled in the hay, his breathing shallow and labored, dark eyes struggling to stay open against the weight of his weakness. Emma's heart clenched painfully as she watched the smaller foal's failed attempts to stand, each try weaker than the last. "You just need a chance," she whispered, kneeling beside him in the soft hay. Her mother's words echoed in her memory like a familiar lullaby. Sometimes the smallest creatures have the strongest spirits. The truth of those words gave her strength now. Looking around the dimly lit stable, Emma's eyes fell on an old feeding bottle left from last spring's lambing season, still tucked away on a shelf. A plan began forming in her mind, taking shape with each passing moment. The old barn out back, where they used to store hay, had a quiet corner hidden from view behind years of accumulated farm equipment. Her father rarely went there anymore. It held too many memories of better days when the farm had prospered and her mother's laugh had filled the air. She gathered supplies quickly but carefully. The bottle, thoroughly cleaned and ready for use, a soft blanket from the tack room that still smelled faintly of leather, and some fresh hay she'd saved from the last cutting. Her hands trembled as she worked, but determination steadied her resolve like an invisible force guiding her actions. She couldn't let Shadow die without trying to save him. She owed him that much at least. As twilight painted the sky in deep purples and blues, streaking the clouds with ribbons of fading light, Emma made her move. She wrapped Shadow carefully in the blanket, cradling him close to her chest like a precious secret. The foal barely made a sound as she carried him across the yard to the old barn, her footsteps careful and quiet on the packed earth, each step measured to avoid detection. Inside the barn, musty air and long shadows greeted them like old friends. Emma had already prepared a corner, laying fresh hay and creating a small enclosed space behind some old feed bins, the perfect hiding spot for her tiny charge. She settled Shadow onto the makeshift bed with gentle hands, arranging the blanket around his trembling form for warmth. "I won't let you die," she whispered, her voice fierce with promise and determination. Shadow's dark eyes met hers, and she saw a flicker of life there, a tiny spark worth fighting for, like a star refusing to be extinguished. The foal nuzzled weakly against her hand as she stroked his velvety nose, his touch as light as a butterfly's wing. Emma's heart raced with the weight of her secret, but she thought of her mother, who had always taught her to fight for what she believed in, to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. This wasn't just about saving a foal anymore. It was about holding on to hope itself, about proving that sometimes love and determination could overcome even the most impossible odds. The old barn creaked in the pre-dawn darkness as Emma pushed open its heavy wooden door. Her flashlight beam cut through the shadows, landing on the small bundle of hay where Shadow lay. The tiny foal lifted his head weakly at her approach, and Emma's heart squeezed with both worry and determination. "Hey there, little one," she whispered, setting down her supplies. Her hands shook slightly as she pulled out her phone, quickly navigating to the horse care website she'd bookmarked the night before. The formula mixture had to be just right. Too thick or too thin could cause problems. Emma measured the powder carefully into the bottle, adding warm water from her thermos. Her eyes were heavy from lack of sleep, but she couldn't rest knowing Shadow needed her. As she shook the bottle, she glanced at Shadow's frail form. "You can do this," she encouraged, though exhaustion made her voice rough. The feeding proved challenging. Shadow's head wobbled as she tried to position the bottle, and more formula dribbled down his chin than made it into his mouth. "Come on, sweetie," Emma pleaded, adjusting the angle as recommended in the online video. Finally, Shadow latched on and began to suck weakly. Relief flooded through her as she watched him drink. Every small swallow felt like a victory. The website had stressed the importance of these early feedings, and Emma was determined to give Shadow his best chance, even if she had to do it alone. In the main stable, John Miller stood in the morning light, watching Blaze wobble around on uncertain legs. The sight brought a sad smile to his face as he remembered Emma's first steps, how his wife had captured it all on video. The memory stung, fresh grief mixing with the assumed loss of Shadow. He patted Daisy's neck, noticing how the mare seemed restless, her head occasionally turning as if searching. "I know, girl," he murmured. "At least we still have this one." He figured Emma must have taken care of Shadow's body early this morning, sparing him that particular pain. The thought of his daughter shouldering that burden made his chest tight. Blaze stumbled closer to Daisy, managing to nurse with growing confidence. John watched them, his mind turning to calculations about the farm's future. One healthy foal wasn't what they'd hoped for, but it was better than nothing. Maybe if they were lucky, Blaze would grow strong enough to attract a good buyer. Later, in the farmhouse kitchen, Emma pushed her scrambled eggs around her plate, her mind on Shadow's next feeding. The guilt of deception sat heavy in her stomach, making it hard to eat. Across the table, John sipped his coffee, lost in his own thoughts. "Not hungry?" he asked, noticing her full plate. "Just tired," Emma mumbled, avoiding his eyes. She could feel his concern, but couldn't bear to look up, afraid her face would betray her secret. "It's been a rough couple of days," John said softly. "Why don't you try to get some rest?" Emma nodded quickly, scraping her chair back. "Actually, I think I'll go do that now." She hurried from the kitchen, leaving her breakfast barely touched. Behind her, John sighed heavily, attributing her behavior to grief over Shadow, never suspecting that at that very moment, his daughter was calculating how long she could wait before sneaking out to the old barn again. The late afternoon sun filtered through the cracks of the old barn's weathered boards, creating dusty beams of light that fell across Emma's determined face. She sat cross-legged on a clean patch of hay, her borrowed library book propped open against her knees. The pages were well worn, marked with colorful sticky notes where she'd found important information about caring for newborn foals. Shadow lay beside her, his dark coat gleaming faintly in the dim light. Emma's fingers traced the words on the page about proper massage techniques to help weak foals gain strength. "Okay, buddy," she whispered. "Let's try this together." With gentle hands, she began working on Shadow's spindly legs, carefully kneading the muscles like the book showed. Her touch was tender but firm, moving from his shoulders down to his hooves. Shadow's ears twitched at her touch, but he stayed calm, trusting her completely. "That's it," Emma encouraged softly, remembering how her mother used to talk to their horses in that same gentle tone. As she worked, Shadow's muscles seemed to respond, becoming warmer under her careful attention. Shadow shifted, his legs moving with newfound purpose. Emma held her breath as the foal wobbled against the hay, struggling to stand. Her heart raced, ready to assist but letting him try. One step, then another. Shaky but determined, Shadow was moving. Tears welled in Emma's eyes as she whispered, "You're doing it." Her heart swelled with hope, watching those precious first steps. In the main stable, John Miller stood watching Blaze and Daisy through the afternoon light. Blaze had grown noticeably stronger over the past days, his coat beginning to shine with health. Daisy nuzzled her foal affectionately, nickering softly as Blaze pranced around her legs with increasing confidence. John's weathered hands rested on the stable door as he calculated. A strong yearling like Blaze could fetch enough at auction to ease the farm's mounting bills. Flipping through his crinkled notebook, he scribbled daunting figures: feed, vet care, training. Still, Blaze's strength gave him hope. As the sun set, Emma sat alone on the porch, her mother's favorite quilt around her shoulders. The cool air carried the sweet scent of hay and wildflowers. Eyes closed, she pictured her mother here, watching sunsets and sharing stories of the horses she had raised. "Mom would have fought for them both," Emma whispered to herself, clutching the quilt tighter. Her mother had always believed in giving every animal a chance, no matter how small or weak they seemed. The memory of her mother's compassionate spirit strengthened Emma's resolve. Saving Shadow wasn't just about the foal anymore. It was about keeping her mother's legacy of love and care alive. Emma watched as the sun painted the sky in vivid oranges and pinks, the very hues her mother used to admire. In that quiet moment, she felt closer to her than she had in months. Though her heart still ached with loss, it now carried a lighter purpose. Shadow and Blaze weren't just foals. They were her way to heal, to remember, and to honor the woman who taught her what it meant to truly care. John Miller trudged through his withering cornfields, each step stirring up a cloud of dust. The sun blazed down on the shriveled stalks, their leaves curling like desperate fingers. He snapped off a stunted ear of corn and peeled it back, revealing kernels far too small for the season. Running a weathered hand across his forehead, he gazed at the old tractor sitting idle at the field's edge. It was worth something, maybe enough to cover a month's worth of bills. The thought of selling it made his stomach twist, but the stack of unpaid invoices on his desk kept him awake at night. "Lord, give me strength," he muttered, stuffing his hands in his pockets as he headed back toward the barn. In the old barn, Emma's heart nearly stopped when she heard the crunch of footsteps approaching. She had just finished giving Shadow his morning bottle when the sound reached her ears. Quickly, she shoved the bottle under a pile of hay and positioned herself in front of the wobbly foal, who let out a soft whimper. "Shh," she whispered, her pulse racing as the barn door creaked open. "Emma," her father's voice echoed through the dusty space. "Have you seen that old pitchfork anywhere?" "Dad," she tried to keep her voice steady. "I think I saw it in the main stable yesterday. Did you check by Blaze's stall?" John stepped further into the barn, his eyes narrowing as they adjusted to the dim light. "What are you doing back here?" "Just thinking," Emma said quickly. "Actually, I wanted to tell you. Blaze took his first real steps yesterday. He's getting stronger every day." John paused, his hand resting on an old wooden beam. Something felt off about the scene before him. but Emma's news about Blaze pushed the thought aside. That's good to hear, honey. I'll check the stable for that pitchfork then." After he left, Emma sagged against the wall, her heart still thundering in her chest. Shadow nuzzled against her leg, oblivious to how close they'd come to being discovered. Later that afternoon, John sat at the kitchen table, staring at the bank letter in his hands. The words, "Final Notice" and "Immediate Action Required" seemed to leap off the page, making his jaw tighten. He smoothed the creases with his calloused fingers, as if that might shrink the intimidating numbers. The weight of what this meant for the farm, and for Emma, her name weighed heavily on his chest. A constant reminder of why he fought so hard for the farm. The old clock ticked steadily, each sound a taunt, echoing, time slipping away. The legacy of generations of millers who had poured their lives into this land weighed on him, a burden almost too heavy to bear. Earlier that morning, sunlight streamed through the stable windows, casting golden rays across Blaze's chestnut coat. John watched with quiet pride as the foal pranced confidently beside Daisy, his mother. Blaze's transformation had been remarkable. His once fragile frame was now strong and sure. John smiled for the first time in weeks, seeing the young horse's potential. A healthy yearling like Blaze could fetch a good price at auction, maybe enough to hold off the bank. In the barn, Emma sat on a hay bale, softly humming an old tune. Nearby, Shadow, smaller than his brother, tentatively nibbled on hay. Though still delicate, he had made incredible progress, his once trembling legs now steady. Emma wiped her eyes, her heart swelling with pride for the little fighter she'd never given up on. That afternoon, as John reviewed the bills at his desk, a sharp knock interrupted him. At the door stood a man in an expensive suit, extending a manicured hand. "Mr. Miller?" "George Carver," the man said smoothly, extending a hand. "I hope my unannounced visit isn't an inconvenience." "Word travels fast in small towns, Mr. Miller. I heard about your mare delivering twins a while back." Carver's eyes gleamed with interest. "Quite rare, as I'm sure you know. I'd be very interested in purchasing such a unique specimen." John's face remained carefully neutral. "I'm afraid you heard wrong, Mr. Carver. We lost one of the foals shortly after birth. Just have the one now." "Ah, that's unfortunate," Carver said, his tone smooth yet calculated. He reached into his breast pocket and retrieved a sleek business card, holding it out with a practiced ease. "Well, should you ever find yourself considering the sale of the surviving foal, I want you to know I'm prepared to make a very generous offer. Far beyond fair market value, in fact, considering the unique circumstances of its birth and the potential it might hold. It's an opportunity I believe could benefit us both." He held out the card and John took it reflexively, the weight of the implied offer sinking in. How much money was Carver really talking about? Enough to ease the crushing debt? Enough to save the farm? The questions churned in his mind as Carver offered a practiced smile. "Think it over," Carver said smoothly. "You know where to reach me." With that, he turned and strode back to his sleek luxury car, the polished metal gleaming in the afternoon sun. The sound of the engine starting was distant, almost surreal, as John stood motionless in the doorway, the business card feeling impossibly heavy in his hand. Later, in the quiet of the farmhouse kitchen, John sat at the worn wooden table, the card still in his calloused hands. He turned it over and over, its pristine edges a sharp contrast to his weathered fingers. The soft amber glow of the setting sun filtered through the window, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. The bank statement lay open before him, its stark numbers telling a relentless tale of mounting debt and dwindling options. His gaze flicked between the card and the statement, his chest tight with the weight of impossible choices. $50,000, he muttered, remembering Carver's casual mention of the sum. It was more money than the farm had seen in years, enough to clear the most pressing debts and maybe even fix the irrigation system before the crops failed completely. John ran a hand through his graying hair, his shoulders heavy with the weight of decision. In the old barn, Emma held her breath as footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. The lantern's warm glow barely illuminated Shadow's hiding spot, but she quickly dimmed it anyway. Her heart pounded as the door creaked open, and she pressed herself against a wooden beam, praying Shadow would stay quiet. Luis Garcia's familiar whistling filled the musty air as he made his way through the barn. Emma watched through the gaps between hay bales as the farmhand's flashlight beam swept across the floor, searching for misplaced tools. Shadow shifted nervously in his makeshift stall, but the soft sound was masked by Luis's boots on the wooden planks. "Must be around here somewhere," Luis muttered in his accented English, rummaging behind old equipment. After what felt like an eternity to Emma, he finally found the wrench he was searching for. With a satisfied grunt, he headed back outside, pulling the barn door shut behind him. Emma waited until the sound of his footsteps faded before her trembling legs gave way, and she sank onto a hay bale. Her heart thundered in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Shadow, sensing her distress, nickered softly and nuzzled her hand. "That was too close," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she ran her fingers over his velvety nose, seeking comfort in his quiet presence. Later that night, Emma lay in her bed, unable to sleep. The old farmhouse creaked and groaned, but beneath those familiar sounds, she could hear her father's heavy footsteps pacing the floor below. His muffled voice drifted up through the floorboards. "The bank won't wait. Have to do something." The words made Emma's stomach twist. She pressed her ear to the floor, straining to hear more. "Could get a good price. Carver's offer." John's voice continued, each word making Emma's hands clench tighter in determination. She thought of Blaze in the stable, growing stronger every day in Shadow, hidden away, but fighting to survive. The idea of either of them being sold, especially to someone like Mr. Carver, made her chest tight with fear and anger. Rolling onto her back, Emma stared at the ceiling, listening to her father's continued pacing. She wouldn't let it happen. She couldn't. These foals were more than just animals. They were her connection to hope, to healing, to memories of her mother. Her jaw set with determination as she listened to her father's troubled movements below. The morning sun streamed through the stable windows as John Miller ran the brush over Blaze's gleaming coat. The foal had grown stronger each day, his legs now sturdy beneath him. Daisy watched from her stall, her gentle eyes following John's movements as he worked. "You're going to make someone very happy," John murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He imagined the farm without Blaze, the empty stall, the quiet absence where playful nickers once filled the air. The thought tore at him, but another vision crept in. A future where the relentless weight of debt was lifted. Fixed equipment, thriving crops, maybe even enough left to repair the leaking farmhouse roof. Sacrifices were necessary, he told himself, but the ache in his chest refused to ease. Blaze nudged at John's pocket, searching for treats. "Sorry, boy, not today," John said, patting the foal's neck with a heavy hand. He tried to steel himself against the growing bond between them, knowing the day would come when he'd have to let go. In the old barn, Emma worked with quiet focus. She slipped the halter over Shadow's head, adjusting the straps with practiced care. The once fragile foal had transformed before her eyes, his movement steadier, his eyes bright with curiosity and life. Every small success felt monumental, a testament to the stubborn hope that had kept her going when the odds seemed impossible. That's it. Easy does it, Emma encouraged as Shadow took a few hesitant steps. Then, as if gaining sudden confidence, the foal broke into a wobbly trot, circling Emma in the small space. His tiny hooves stirred up dust motes that floated like golden flecks in the beams of sunlight streaming through the barn's weathered boards. Emma's face lit up with pure joy. "Look at you go," she whispered, her voice brimming with excitement. Shadow tossed his head playfully, as though he shared her delight. Kneeling beside him, she ran a gentle hand along his side, her heart swelling with love and hope. "Someday, you'll run free in the pasture, just like your brother. I promise." Later that afternoon, Emma passed her father's office and paused when she heard him dialing. Her stomach tightened as she realized who he must be calling. Pressing herself against the wall, she held her breath, straining to hear. "Yes, Mr. Carver, I've been considering your offer," John said, his voice heavy but firm. There was a pause, and Emma's heart raced. "About the twins? Yes, there was a second foal, but it died." Another pause followed, and his tone grew curt. "No, I didn't keep it. What would be the point?" Emma bit her lip to stifle a gasp, her hands trembling as she clenched them into fists. Shadow wasn't just a secret anymore. He was a lifeline she couldn't let slip away. Emma's hands clenched into fists as she heard Mr. Carver's muffled voice grow more animated through the phone. Her father's responses became shorter, more guarded. "I understand your interest, Mr. Carver, but like I said, there's only Blaze now." John's tone carried a note of finality, but Mr. Carver seemed unwilling to let the subject drop. "Yes, we can discuss the price when you visit tomorrow. Goodbye." Emma slipped away from the door, her heart pounding. Mr. Carver's sudden interest in the twins made her stomach twist with worry. She needed to be more careful than ever now. Shadow's safety depended on it. The morning dew still clung to the grass as Mr. George Carver's black luxury car crept along the Miller Farms driveway. John Miller watched from behind the kitchen curtain, his coffee growing cold in his hands. This was the third time this week Carver had driven by, each pass slower than the last. "Like a vulture circling," John muttered, his jaw tightening. The rumors had started at the feed store, then spread to the diner, and now it seemed the whole town was whispering about twin foals at the Miller place. John knew someone must have talked, maybe the delivery boy, or one of the occasional farmhands. Carver's car paused near the old barn, and John's stomach knotted. The businessman's head turned slowly, taking in every detail of the property. After what felt like an eternity, the car pulled away in a cloud of dust. By midday, Emma stood in the stable with Blaze, her hand running along his strong neck. The foal had filled out beautifully, his coat gleaming in the sunlight that streamed through the stable windows. His legs were sturdy now, and he moved with growing confidence around his stall. "You're getting so big," Emma whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She could see what everyone else saw, a valuable young horse, one that could fetch a good price. Blaze nudged her pocket for treats, and she pulled out a small apple she'd saved from lunch. As he munched contentedly, Emma fought back tears. The thought of him being sold, taken away from the farm, from Daisy, from her, it made her heart ache. In the late afternoon, Emma slipped into the old barn, carrying fresh hay for Shadow. The young foal lifted his head at her approach, letting out a soft whinny of recognition that made Emma's heart swell. His progress over the past week had been remarkable. Where once he could barely stand, he now moved with growing strength, his eyes bright and alert. "Hey there, beautiful boy," Emma called softly. Shadow walked over to her, his step sure and steady. He pressed his velvet nose against her hand, and Emma felt tears spring to her eyes, happy ones this time. The trust in his gentle gaze, the way he responded to her voice, it was everything she'd hoped for during those terrifying first days when she wasn't sure he would survive. Emma wrapped her arms around Shadow's neck, breathing in his sweet hay and sunshine scent. "You're my miracle," she whispered as Shadow nickered softly in response. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she held him, overwhelmed by how far they'd come together. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Mrs. Ellen Parker set a warm loaf of bread on the miller's worn wooden table. The sweet, yeasty smell filled the kitchen, reminding John of simpler times when his wife would bake every Sunday morning. "Fresh from the oven," Mrs. Parker said, smoothing her apron. "Though I suspect you've got more exciting things than bread happening around here." Her eyes twinkled with barely contained curiosity. John's shoulders tensed as he poured them both coffee. "Just the usual farm business, Ellen. Nothing special." "Oh?" Mrs. Parker stirred sugar into her cup. "That's not what I heard at the quilting circle. Mary Thompson was saying her sister, you know, Dr. Susan, mentioned something about special horses being born here." John kept his face neutral, though his hand tightened around his coffee mug. "Just one healthy foal. Nothing extraordinary about that." In the old barn at midday, Emma sat cross-legged on a fresh pile of hay, holding a worn library book titled Essential Horse Care. Shadow stood nearby, his ears forward and alert as she read aloud. "A balanced diet is crucial for young horses," Emma read, occasionally glancing up to check on her secret charge. Shadow's coat, once dull and lifeless, now showed signs of shine. His legs, though still thin, supported him better each day. This daily ritual had become Emma's favorite part of the day. Here, surrounded by the musty smell of hay and Shadow's soft nickering, she felt closest to her mother's memory. "Mom would have loved you," she whispered, reaching out to stroke Shadow's nose. Later that afternoon, Mr. George Carver's polished shoes kicked up dust as he stood by the boundary fence, his expensive suit out of place against the pastoral backdrop. Luis Garcia was repairing a section of the fence, his worn work gloves gripping the wire. "Fine day for fence mending," Carver said smoothly, pulling out his leather wallet. "Must be hard work, maintaining such a large property." Luis wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, eyeing the crisp bills Carver held casually between his fingers. "I understand you help out around here sometimes," Carver continued. "Perhaps you've noticed anything interesting in the barns? About the horses, maybe?" He extended the money toward Luis. Luis's hand stilled on the fence wire. He looked at the money, then back at his work. After a long moment, he shook his head. "Sorry, senor. I just fix fences." He turned back to his task, leaving Carver's hand suspended in the air with the unclaimed bribe. The morning light filtered through the stable windows as John ran the brush along Blaze's gleaming coat. The foal had grown stronger each day, his muscles developing nicely beneath his chestnut fur. John's hand paused mid-stroke as he thought about Mr. Carver's offer again. $20,000, he muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. That kind of money would clear most of their pressing debts. The bank wouldn't be breathing down his neck anymore. Maybe he could even fix the tractor that had been sitting idle for months. Blaze nudged John's hand, looking for attention. "You're worth every penny of it, aren't you?" John said softly, patting the foal's neck. The thought of selling Blaze made his chest tight, but the stack of unpaid bills on his desk weighed heavily on his mind. In the old barn, Emma carefully measured Shadow's feed, adding the supplements she'd researched. The foal's ribs were less visible now, his coat starting to develop a healthy sheen. "Ready for your walk?" she asked, smiling, as Shadow perked up at her voice. She led him slowly around the barn's interior, keeping one hand on his side for support. Shadow's steps were steadier than yesterday, though he still wobbled occasionally. "That's it," Emma encouraged as he completed a full circle. You're getting stronger every day." As dusk settled over the farm, casting long shadows through the farmhouse windows, John found Emma in the living room. "We need to talk," he said, his voice grave. Emma looked up from her homework, sensing what was coming. "Dad, please." "Mr. Carver made another offer today. $20,000 for Blaze." Emma jumped to her feet, her textbook falling to the floor. "You can't sell him." "Emma, be reasonable. This money could save the farm. We're drowning in debt, and I don't care about the money." Emma's voice cracked. "Blaze belongs here with us." John ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Why are you so attached to this foal? You've never been this way about any of our other horses we've sold." Emma wrapped her arms around herself, fighting back tears. She wanted desperately to tell him about Shadow, to show him how both foals were thriving, but she couldn't risk it. Not yet. Because she struggled to find words that wouldn't reveal her secret. Because Mom would have wanted them to stay together, Blaze and Daisy. John's expression softened at the mention of his late wife, but his voice remained firm. "Your mother would have wanted us to keep the farm running. Sometimes that means making hard choices." "Please, Dad," Emma begged. "There has to be another way." "Then tell me why this matters so much to you," John demanded, studying her face intently. "There's something you're not telling me." Emma looked away, her heart pounding. She couldn't tell him about Shadow, not until she was sure he would survive. I can't lose anything else," she whispered. "Not after Mom." John Miller sat on the weathered farmhouse porch, his hands trembling as he opened yet another letter from the bank. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden boards, but the warmth did nothing to ease the chill that spread through him as he read the words. Final notice stood out in bold red letters at the top. The bank was giving him just 2 more weeks to make good on his payments. His throat felt dry as he calculated the numbers again. They needed $15,000 just to catch up on the mortgage, let alone the equipment loans and feed bills. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket, not wanting Emma to see it. The weight of it felt like a stone against his chest. In the old barn at midday, Emma worked with Shadow, her determination growing stronger with each passing hour. She'd fashioned a simple training aid from some soft rope, creating a gentle guide to help steady the foal as he walked. "Easy now," she whispered, holding the rope loosely as Shadow took tentative steps. The young horse lifted each hoof carefully, placing them with growing confidence. Emma had lined up some hay bales to create a small circuit, giving Shadow a path to follow. "You're doing so well," she encouraged, watching as Shadow managed to complete a full circle without stumbling. His dark coat was starting to shine from her careful grooming, and his eyes were bright with interest. Every small victory made her heart swell with pride. As the sun began to set, casting orange light through the stable windows, Emma stood in the doorway and watched her father adjust the settings on his digital camera. John positioned himself carefully, trying to capture Blaze's best angles. The young foal stood proudly next to his mother, his chestnut coat gleaming from the thorough grooming John had given him earlier. "Just a few more," John muttered, checking each photo on the small screen. "Need to show how strong he's getting." Emma's stomach churned as she realized these photos were meant for Mr. Carver. Each click of the camera felt like a countdown to losing Blaze forever. She watched as her father coaxed Blaze to turn, showing off his developing muscle tone and straight legs. "He's really filling out nicely," John said, more to himself than to Emma. "Mr. Carver will be impressed with his progress." Emma gripped the stable doorframe tightly, her knuckles turning white. She wanted to scream, to beg her father not to sell Blaze, but she knew the desperate look in his eyes. It was the same look he'd worn when they'd had to sell her mother's piano last month. Emma stood frozen in the hallway outside the farmhouse living room, her heart pounding as she listened to her father's voice. Through the partially open door, she could see him pacing, phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, Mr. Carver. 2 days would work fine," John said, his voice tight but determined. "We can meet here at the farm to discuss the final details." Emma's hands trembled as she pressed them against the wall. The wood paneling felt cool against her palms, grounding her as her world seemed to spin. "The price we discussed seems fair," John continued. "Blaze is healthy now, getting stronger every day." Unable to listen anymore, Emma crept away from the door and up the creaking stairs to her bedroom. The moonlight streaming through her window cast shadows across her quilted bedspread, the last one her mother had made before getting sick. At midnight, Emma sat cross-legged on her bed, tears streaming down her face as she held a silver-framed photograph. In it, her mother smiled brightly, one arm around Emma as they stood in front of the stable. It had been taken just last summer, before everything changed. "Mom," Emma whispered, running her finger across the glass, "I don't know what to do anymore. Dad's going to sell Blaze, and if Mr. Carver finds out about Shadow—" She clutched the photo tighter, her tears falling onto the frame. "I've tried so hard to save them both, just like you would have wanted." As she stared at her mother's kind eyes in the photograph, something shifted inside Emma. The answer became clear. She couldn't keep hiding Shadow. The secrecy that had seemed like protection now felt like a wall between her and her father, one that needed to come down before it was too late. In the old barn, just before sunrise, Emma stood beside Shadow's makeshift stall. The young foal nickered softly, pressing his nose against her hand. His coat was sleek now, his legs stronger, though still not as robust as his brother's. "Tomorrow everything changes," Emma whispered, stroking Shadow's neck. Her voice quivered slightly, but her resolve was firm. "I have to tell Dad about you. He needs to know you're alive, that you're getting stronger." She leaned her forehead against Shadow's warm neck, breathing in his familiar scent. "I just hope he can understand why I kept you hidden. I hope he sees how special you are." Shadow shifted, turning to nuzzle Emma's shoulder as if sensing her distress. The gentle gesture brought fresh tears to her eyes. But these weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of determination, of hope that somehow, revealing the truth, would help save both foals. "We'll face whatever comes together," Emma promised Shadow softly. "No matter what happens tomorrow, you won't be alone anymore." The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmyard as Emma led her father toward the old barn. Her hands trembled, but she kept her voice steady. "Dad, there's something I need to show you," she said, trying to mask her nervousness. "It's important." John followed, his expression puzzled. "Emma, I've got work to do. Mr. Carver's coming tomorrow, and I need to get things ready. Please, Dad, just trust me for a minute." They reached the old barn's weathered door. Emma's fingers lingered on the rusty latch, her heart hammering in her chest. With a deep breath, she pushed it open. Inside, the barn was dim and cool. Dust motes danced in the rays of sunlight that streamed through the gaps in the wooden walls. Emma led her father to the back corner, where she'd created a cozy stall with fresh hay and blankets. Shadow stood there, his coat gleaming in the filtered light. The foal perked his ears at their approach, nickering softly at Emma's familiar presence. John stopped dead in his tracks. His face went pale, then flushed red with anger. "What? What is this?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of thunder. "It's Shadow," Emma said softly. "He didn't die. I've been taking care of him." "You've been lying to me." John's voice rose sharply. "All this time, you let me believe—" He ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "How could you do this, Emma? How could you betray me like this?" "Dad, Do you have any idea what you've done?" John's words echoed off the barn walls. "The responsibility? The cost? The risk? We can barely keep this farm afloat as it is." Emma's shoulders shook as tears began to fall. "I couldn't let him die. Not after Mom." Her voice broke. "I couldn't lose anyone else. Shadow was so small, but he wanted to live. I could see it in his eyes." They stood there in the dusty barn light, Shadow watching them quietly from his corner. John's anger seemed to deflate as he watched his daughter cry. "Every day I came out here," Emma continued, wiping her eyes, "I learned everything I could about caring for him. I read books, watched videos. He got stronger, Dad. He wanted to live, just like Mom wanted to live." John's face softened as Emma's words sank in. He stepped forward and pulled her into his arms, their shared grief spilling out in tears. They stood by Shadow's stall, father and daughter holding each other tightly as the foal gently nudged their shoulders, his soft nose a quiet comfort. "I miss her so much, Dad," Emma sobbed into his shirt. "I couldn't let Shadow die. I just couldn't." John stroked her hair, his anger melting into a deep, aching sadness. "Oh, Emma," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You're so brave, so stubborn, just like her." Later, the warm glow of the kitchen light wrapped around them as they sat at the worn wooden table. The evening sun filtered through the curtains, casting gentle shadows on their faces. John's calloused hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee as he spoke. "I'm sorry I yelled," he said quietly, his gaze meeting Emma's. "What you did, it took real courage." Tears welled in Emma's eyes. "I couldn't let him die, Dad," she whispered. "Not after Mom." Her voice faltered, and she looked down at her hands. John reached across the table and squeezed her hand firmly. "I know, sweetheart," he said, his voice soft. "You've got her heart. She would have done the same thing." He took a deep breath, his decision clear. "We're keeping them both, Blaze and Shadow." Emma's eyes widened. "But what about the farm? The bills?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. John nodded slowly. "We'll figure something out," he said. "Some things are worth more than money." That evening, John found himself lingering in the stable, watching Blaze. The stronger foal pranced around Daisy, his movements full of life and energy. For the first time, John noticed the intelligent gleam in Blaze's eyes, the way he stayed close to his mother, and the tender nuzzles Daisy gave him. "They're not just livestock, are they, girl?" he murmured to Daisy. The mare blinked at him serenely, her calm presence reminding him of his wife's steady wisdom. As night settled over the farm, John followed Emma into the old barn. Shadow greeted them with a soft whinny. Emma proudly showed her father the setup she had created, carefully organized with a feeding schedule on the wall, an exercise area marked with rope, and perfectly clean bedding. "You did all this yourself?" John asked, amazement in his voice. Emma nodded. "I learned from those library books," she said, demonstrating how she warmed Shadow's formula. "See? He likes it warm, but not too hot." John watched as Shadow tentatively approached him. The foal's soft nose brushed against his palm, warm and velvety. Something tight in John's chest loosened, and he gently stroked Shadow's neck. "Hey there, little guy," he whispered, a rare smile breaking across his face. "Looks like you're part of the family after all." Emma leaned against her father's arm as they tended to Shadow together, their movements falling into a natural rhythm. The old barn, which had held Emma's secret for so long, now held something new, the beginning of healing, of family coming together again. John Miller sat at his desk in the farmhouse office, sunlight streaming through the dusty window. His fingers hesitated over Mr. George Carver's business card before he picked up the phone and dialed. "Mr. Carver, this is John Miller." He kept his voice steady. "I've made my decision about Blaze. I won't be selling." The line crackled with silence before Mr. Carver's smooth voice responded. "That's disappointing, Mr. Miller. I heard you were in quite a financial bind. My offer was more than generous." "Money's not everything, Mr. Carver." "Interesting change of heart." Mr. Carver's tone grew cold. "You know, rare twins are quite valuable. It would be a shame if something happened to either of them." John's grip tightened on the receiver. "Is that a threat?" "Just an observation. Good day, Mr. Miller." The line went dead. By midday, the sun had warmed the barnyard as Emma and John worked together, hammering the last posts into place for a small paddock. Emma scattered fresh hay while John double-checked the fence's stability. "Ready to bring them out?" John asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. Emma nodded eagerly. They led Daisy out first, then brought Blaze and Shadow from their separate shelters. The foals blinked in the bright sunlight, their legs wobbling slightly on the uneven ground. Blaze took a tentative step forward, his copper coat gleaming. Shadow, darker and still smaller, stayed close to Emma at first. Then, curiosity overcame caution. The two foals approached each other slowly, their ears pricked forward in interest. "Look, Dad," Emma whispered as the twins touched noses for the first time. Daisy watched from nearby, giving a soft snort that seemed to approve of the reunion. The foals circled each other, their movements becoming more playful. Shadow seemed to gain confidence from his stronger brother's presence, attempting a small jump that made Emma laugh out loud. As evening approached, Mr. George Carver's expensive car idled on the dirt road bordering the Miller property. His manicured fingers drummed against the steering wheel as he watched the family scene through binoculars. The twins were even more perfect than he'd imagined, a matching set that could make him a fortune. Under the cover of darkness, he dialed quickly. "Jake, bring Tom tomorrow. Those foals are coming with us, no matter what." He ended the call, anger etched on his face. The Miller farmhouse lay quiet under the stars. Inside, Emma slept peacefully beneath her grandmother's quilt, while John dozed in his armchair, a book resting on his chest. Outside, the stable light cast a soft glow over Blaze, Shadow, and Daisy, who stood watchful over her foals. At the property's edge, two dark figures moved silently, lead ropes at their belts. Pausing behind a tree, one whispered, "The black one first, quick and quiet." Reaching the gate, they worked the latch with practiced hands. The faint click of metal broke the night's silence. Daisy's head lifted, ears twitching at the unfamiliar scent. In her room, Emma stirred, sensing something amiss. Listening closely, she caught the faint creak of hinges. Heart racing, she slipped to the window and spotted shadows near the paddock. "Dad," she whispered, rushing to his room. "There's someone by the stable." John snapped awake, grabbing his flashlight. "Stay close," he said firmly. Together, they moved swiftly through the house, every second feeling vital. Emma and John sprinted from the farmhouse, John's flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. In its glare, two men in black struggled to drag Blaze and Shadow from the paddock. Shadow's frightened whinnies pierced the night, while Blaze stomped nervously. "Hey, stop right there!" John's voice thundered as he steadied the flashlight, illuminating the scene. Emma rushed ahead, her voice cracking with emotion. "Get away from them!" The smaller man gripped Shadow's rope, while his partner wrestled Blaze, who pulled against him with growing agitation. "Back off!" the larger man snarled, pulling a metal pipe from behind his back. Moonlight glinted off its surface. "This doesn't concern you." John moved in front of Emma, his voice firm despite the tremor beneath it. "Those are our horses. Let them go." The man smirked. "Mr. Carver sends his regards. If he can't buy them, he'll take them." "You can't have them," Emma shouted, her fists clenched, fear giving way to defiance. The air crackled with tension as the men advanced. Then Blaze and Shadow acted. Both reared, their hooves pawing the air as high-pitched whinnies rang out. Daisy joined in, her powerful neigh echoing across the farm. Lights flickered on in neighboring houses, and dogs barked furiously. The men hesitated, glancing around as the foal's display grew more intense. Shadow, once so timid, matched Blaze's protective stance, their hooves striking the air like a living barrier. From his cottage at the edge of the property, Luis Garcia frantically called the sheriff. "Sheriff Mason? This is Luis Garcia at the Miller farm. Men are here trying to steal the horses. John and Emma are confronting them right now." The foals held their ground, their courage buying time as help raced toward the farm. "I'm on my way." Sheriff Harold Mason's voice crackled through the phone. "Stay on the line, Luis. What do you see?" Luis peered through the darkness. "Two men in black. One's got a weapon. Looks like a pipe. The Millers are by the paddock." Tension thickened as lights flickered on in neighboring houses. A dog barked, then another. The man with the pipe waved it threateningly at John. "Back off, or you'll regret it." Emma stood firm, her hand steady on Shadow's neck. The foal pressed against her, trembling but unwilling to flee. Blaze stomped and snorted, pulling against the other man's grip. "You're not taking them," Emma said, her voice unwavering. The growing noise from neighbors and the sound of approaching sirens unnerved the men. The smaller one dropped Blaze's rope. "This isn't worth it," he hissed, ready to bolt. Sheriff Mason's patrol car roared into the driveway, lights flashing. Stepping out, he barked, "Drop the pipe! Hands where I can see them! On your knees! Now!" The men panicked and ran, but their escape was cut off by an unlikely defense. Blaze and Shadow, side by side, moved boldly forward. Blaze reared, his hooves slicing through the air, forcing one man to stumble back. Shadow, once so timid, mimicked his brother, snorting and pawing at the ground. "Get out of the way, you stupid animals!" the larger man shouted, but his voice wavered. The foals held their ground, their courage halting the would-be thieves as sirens closed in. The commotion intensified as Sheriff Mason's patrol car lights illuminated the scene. The hired men panicked, breaking in opposite directions. John Miller, running on pure adrenaline, launched himself at the larger man who still gripped the metal pipe. They tumbled to the ground, wrestling in the dewy grass. "Stop right there!" Emma's voice cut through the farmyard as the second man tried to escape. Sheriff Mason swiftly intercepted, twisting the suspect's arm behind his back. "You're under arrest," he said, snapping on handcuffs. As dawn broke, headlights pierced the dimness. Mr. George Carver's black car raced toward the driveway, but the Millers' neighbors acted fast. Luis Garcia, guided by Mrs. Parker in her nightgown, blocked the path with his tractor. Carver's car screeched to a halt. "Step out with your hands up," Sheriff Mason commanded. Carver hesitated, his fury clear as his plan unraveled. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the scene. The hired men handcuffed on the ground, Carver's wrinkled suit, and his demand for a lawyer. "You'll get your chance," Mason replied, turning to John and Emma. "We'll need your statements later. Rest now. You've been through enough." As officers loaded the criminals into patrol cars, Carver shouted, "This isn't over, Miller. Those foals could have made you rich." John, arm around Emma, shook his head. "Some things are worth more than money," he said quietly. By morning, sunlight filled the farmhouse as John hugged Emma tightly. The night's events had left them shaken, but thankful. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you about Shadow sooner," Emma whispered, her voice thick with emotion. John stroked her hair. No, I should be sorry. You saw what I couldn't, that every life is precious. Your mother would be so proud. Tears filled Emma's eyes. You really think so? I know so. You've got her heart and determination. Thank you for reminding me what truly matters. By midday, word spread through the community, and a local reporter arrived to document the story of the twin foals. In the paddock, Blaze and Shadow pranced under Daisy's watchful eye, seemingly aware of the attention. It's not just about their survival, Emma said, watching Shadow trot beside Blaze. It's about believing when others give up. The reporter eagerly captured the tale of love, courage, and determination. That afternoon, the farmhouse buzzed with calls and visits. Emma sat on the couch, taking notes as neighbors offered help. The feed store is giving us 3 months of supplies at half price, John said, hanging up the phone in disbelief. Emma added it to her growing list. The Harrisons dropped off hay, and Mrs. Parker has extra medicine. The community's outpouring of generosity turned what could have been tragedy into hope, all sparked by the twin foals who had captured their hearts. Later that evening, Emma sat in the stable, the setting sun casting a soft golden glow. Blaze, his sleek coat shining, nuzzled her hair playfully, making her giggle, while Shadow pressed his muzzle into her arm for attention. Both foals had grown stronger with time, their personalities shining, Blaze bold and spirited, Shadow gentle and affectionate. You two are famous now, Emma murmured, stroking Shadow's neck. Through the open door, Daisy grazed peacefully, occasionally glancing toward her foals. The sight of Blaze standing tall and Shadow moving gracefully filled her with pride. In the barn office, Emma joined John as he studied some papers spread across the desk. The evening breeze carried the scent of hay through the window. I've been thinking, John said, tapping his notes. With the attention these two have brought, we could start a breeding program. Focus on quality care, like you've done with Shadow. Maybe even offer tours or partner with schools. Emma's eyes lit up. We could teach horse care and host school visits. Maybe work with the vet school, too. John smiled at her excitement. Exactly. A farm your mother would have been proud of, helping animals and people alike. Together, they planned, their ideas unfolding with hope, while the soft nickers of the foals echoed in the warm evening air. The next morning, sunlight stretched across the farm as John and Emma hammered new fence posts into place. The donated lumber gleamed, full of promise. These will last us years, John said, wiping his brow. Emma handed him another nail, her eyes scanning the fields. We could set up training areas there, she suggested, pointing to a grassy stretch. And a special paddock for mares over there. John paused, following her gaze. You've thought this through, he said, pride in his voice. I have, Emma admitted. I've been researching breeding programs. With Blaze and Shadow thriving, maybe we could help other horses, too. Around midday, the sound of a car pulling up to the stable drew their attention. Dr. Susan Thompson stepped out, her medical bag in hand. Emma's heart skipped. No one had called for a vet. I heard everything, Dr. Thompson said as she approached. I had to see it for myself. They led her to the stable, where Blaze and Shadow stood side by side, their coats glossy with health. Daisy grazed nearby, chewing hay contentedly. Dr. Thompson's eyes widened as she examined Shadow. I can't believe this is the same foal, she said, running her hands along his flanks. His muscle tone, his breathing. It's remarkable. She turned to Emma. You did this? Emma nodded shyly. I read everything I could. Followed feeding schedules, did leg exercises. Dr. Thompson straightened, her voice softening. I was wrong. When I warned you about twin births, well, I've seen so many turn out badly. But this, she gestured at the healthy foals, this is extraordinary. You proved me wrong, Emma, and I'm glad you did. John placed a hand on Emma's shoulder, pride shining in his eyes. She proved us all wrong. Later that afternoon, Emma and John sat on the farmhouse porch, watching the sunset bathe the fields in warm hues of orange and pink. The freshly cut lumber from their morning's work stood in neat rows, ready for fencing. "Dad?" Emma asked hesitantly, twisting her hands in her lap. "Do you think Mom would be proud of what we're doing with the farm?" John was silent for a moment, his eyes misty. He reached over and took Emma's hand. "Your mother would be incredibly proud, not just of the farm, but of you. Your courage, your determination, that's her in you." The morning breeze stirred as Emma gently placed the lightweight saddle on Shadow's back. Her hands moved confidently, adjusting straps and checking the fit. Shadow stood calmly, his dark coat shining in the sunlight. Nearby, Blaze galloped in playful circles, kicking up small clouds of dust. "Easy, boy," Emma whispered, patting Shadow's neck. The young horse turned to nuzzle her shoulder, drawing a smile. Countless hours of trust building had led to this moment, reflected in Shadow's calm demeanor. Blaze paused, ears perked, watching with interest. Over the weeks, the foals had become inseparable, their bond as strong as any family tie. Shadow shifted slightly under the saddle, but remained composed, ready for whatever came next. By midday, Emma led both horses to the open fields. John stood at the fence, his weathered hands gripping the wood, watching as she carefully mounted Shadow for the first time. The horse stood steady, sensing the moment's importance. "That's it," Emma murmured, settling into the saddle. Shadow took a few tentative steps, guided by her gentle commands, while Blaze trotted alongside, acting as a vigilant guardian. Tears welled in John's eyes as Emma guided Shadow in a slow circle, her quiet determination reminding him of his late wife. Nearby, Daisy grazed peacefully, occasionally checking on her foals. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Emma directed Shadow toward a rolling hill at the edge of their property. Blaze kept pace, steady and protective. The three moved in harmony against the golden sky. From afar, John waved proudly, his smile unmistakable. Emma sat tall in the saddle, her confidence shining. Shadow, once a fragile foal, now moved with strength and grace. Together with Blaze, they embodied the Miller family's enduring hope, determination, and unbreakable bonds. If you enjoyed the story of Emma Miller, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.